Greetings, my friends. Lady K and myself just recently returned from Northern Maine, right up, snugged up next to Baxter State Park, where the 1970 rock throwing incident took place. And I thought for Monsters and Mayhem, Episode 3, we would share some segments out of the book Camping Out by C.A. Stevens, where he chronicles the adventures, the travels of a group of young men as they journey, I believe it's from Norwalk or Norway, all the way up to Mount Katahdin. I'm just going to share the parts where they talked about the strange tale of Poomola in chapter 10. And I want you guys to consider, to ponder, to give me your insight. You MIT, PhD, Sasquatchers, Zen Yetians, how much of this is true? How much of this account is real versus made up fiction? It's pretty clear, or I think it's pretty clear, or I suppose we can make the strong assumption that it is at least rooted in fact. It's interesting, this was written in 1909, 1910. They don't call it Bigfoot. They referred to it as the devil, as described by the indigenous people, the local Indians, an Indian devil, because the Indians thought it was a devil, or at least that's what they were relating to the Anglos. It's interesting, at the beginning of this account, he details a lot of owl vocalization. Heard such a serenade from owls as our fire drew round us. Screeches and the most dismal hoots blended in horrible concert. Round and round us they glided in noiseless circles. There were scores of them. It was utterly impossible to sleep, and the frequent discharge of our guns failed to disperse them. He states that they're in a spot where the lumbermen wouldn't come into such a region as this. We crossed their old trail 10 miles below. As the days passed, we began to notice that Hughie seemed uneasy and watchful. "What can ail the old man?" asked Zeke as we were making the rounds of traps one day. "He don't act at all as he did the first few days we were in here. Haven't you noticed it?" Yes, I had noticed it, and we agreed to rally the old chap a little when we got back. Well, after supper that night, seeing Hughie looking sulking and absent, I asked all at once, "What is it, Hughie? Aren't things going on right here?" The old man turned and looked at us a moment, as if not certain what he should answer. "I never like to be laughed at, especially by boys. I thought, at first, we'd struck a fine stream, and perhaps it's all fancy, for I haven't seen or heard a single thing wrong yet. But I've been feeling for several days just as there was something, either man or beast, hanging round us here. It may be a catamount, or it may be some mean thief of a river driver sneaking about for a chance to steal our fur, or some Indian who hunts here and would be glad to be rid of us. Can't tell. And perhaps it's all my notion, but I can't get rid of it. And I remember once when I was up at Teloss Lake, I felt just so several days. And finally one night I hid in a clump of hemlocks a little ways from my camp and didn't go to it at all. Along in the night I heard a noise about it and saw what I took for men there. I didn't speak or fire on them. Things were upset round the next morning, but I had moved my fur the day before. And another time, I was out beyond Katahdin, and several days before I had seen any sign, I began to feel that something was watching me. A night or two after, I woke up and saw a catamount glaring at me from a treetop. I suppose he'd been prowling round, but had kept out of sight, and I think we shall find that there's something unusual lurking round us now. Oh, Hughie's presentiments served to keep us watchful and vigilant. But several days passed without the least sign of anyone being near us, and we were beginning to forget it when one evening I saw what certainly justified Hughie's suspicions. I had left the fire to bring some water from the brook, which was within a few rods of us. I had stooped to dip it up when, as I rose, I caught a glimpse of what I took to be a man, standing at a little distance. In an instant it vanished behind a shrubby fir. I felt quite positive, yet it was so dark, and whatever I had seen was out of sight so quick, that I knew I was very liable to have been mistaken. Checking my first impulse to run to camp and give an alarm, I decided to say nothing at present but watch. The evening passed. By 9 o'clock, Huey and Zeke were both asleep. I lay down but kept awake. The leaves had fallen and covered the ground with a dry and rustling carpet. After a while, I began to distinguish footsteps among them at a distance. They were faint and stealthy, and I was somewhat in doubt whether it was not my fancy, till the sharp snap of a twig convinced me. It might easily have been a lucivee or a fisher or a bear, but I at once connected it to what I had seen in the evening. I listened breathlessly. The steps were coming nearer, but it was very dark under the thick spruce boughs. Suddenly the steps ceased, and for a few moments all was still. Then I saw a dark shadow pass a narrow vista where the moonlight fell through the black treetops. It had the shape of a man. The steps went on as if the creature, or whatever it was, were passing around us, keeping at about the same distance. Gradually it came around to the point where I had first heard it. There was another pause, and again I saw it cross the moonlit line to continue its walk around our camp. I wasn't much scared, but its movements gave me a strange sort of feeling. I remember thinking it was no use to wake Zeke or Huey, who was snoring away at a great rate, so cocking my gun, I crept noiselessly down the path we had beaten to the brook, to get near the place where I had seen the shadow in the moonlight. Creeping up within 2 or 3 rods, I crouched at the root of a fallen tree and waited. The footsteps were again approaching in their circuit. There was the same pause as before, and again the form stepped into the moonlight a moment and was again in the shadow. But the moon was pouring down brightly, and I distinctly saw its shape. The figure of a man, looking brown and naked, save where a hairy outline showed against the light. A feeling of sickness or horror came over me. The idea of using my gun did not even present itself. I crept back as silently as I came down. I heard the steps come around again, and then they grew fainter and fainter as the walker moved off into the forest. It was getting towards morning. I sat down to think the matter over. Presently Huey woke. "You up?" said he. Whereupon I told him what I had seen. He listened without a word till I was describing how it looked as I last saw it, when he exclaimed, "It's an Indian devil. It's old Poomola. That's just as I heard the old town Indians describe it 100 times. But I always thought it was all a lie. They always left a place as soon as they'd seen one of those things, and I reckon we'd better." Nothing further was seen for some time. I remember we were up near the head of the lake that afternoon. Our camp was at the foot or lower end. It was getting dusk as we paddled along. There were several islands in the lake, nearly all of them craggy and high. Just as we were passing the lower one, we heard a curious noise, a sort of wah, wah. And looking round to the island, we saw a strange, man-like creature standing upright on a rock overlooking the water. We were not more than 8 rods off, and it was not so dark but that we could see it plainly enough. As we stopped paddling, it uttered the same sound again, a noise between a grunt and a bark. I knew at once it was the same creature I had seen before, and told them so. It must have swum half a mile to get up on the island. If we hadn't been the fools, we should have gone up and found out then and there what it was, and so solved the mystery. For the island was small, and we should have had it completely penned up and at our mercy. But we were boys then, with our heads full of Huey's big stories, and for Huey himself, all the fur in Maine wouldn't have hired him to go a stroke nearer. Zeke hallowed at it, whereupon it raised its forepaws or arms and swung them about like a drunken man, making the same noise as before. It was growing dark, and we came off and left it. And then, just as we were getting ready to leave the spot, a few days later, and I was just coming away when I heard behind me the same queer sound we had heard at the island, and looking up, saw the beast man again, standing at the top of the crag. He wasn't more than 100 feet off, so I had a pretty good view of him as he stepped out against the clear sunset sky. It was the same form and shape as before, fully as tall as a man, and I could now see his face. Perhaps it was partly fear, but I did think it had a devilish look. There was a tuft of thick hair on the head, which lent a frightful expression to the face. If this was what the Indians used to see, I don't wonder they thought it was the devil. I had my gun and slowly raised it as if to take aim. The creature raised his arm in the same way, but I had no thoughts of firing. I didn't dare to. And when I lowered my gun, the creature dropped its arms with another wah, wah. I know I was frightened, yet I saw it plainly enough and could have sworn to its identity anywhere. I don't know how long we stood staring at each other, but I saw it was growing darker, and stepping backwards till I was out of sight behind a cedar, I went into camp about as fast as my legs would carry me. Zeke was all for going down altogether and shooting at it, but Huey wouldn't hear of it. He was pretty strongly tinged with the old Indian's whims concerning Poomola, the demon of the mountain near us. We'd no business with it, he said, and he'd have nothing to do with it whatever, unless he was obliged to. I've thought about it a great deal since, but I never could satisfy myself what it was we saw. I heard of wild men, of children carried off and reared by wild beasts, and the Indians were always telling of Poomola, but I never could settle it in my mind. I know there are a great many things in the northern wilderness which the scientific men would laugh at a person for seeing or trying to describe. But here's my story. You can take it for what it is worth, and so must the reader. But we record it as a very fair specimen of hundreds of similar yarns common amongst the lumbermen and Indians concerning the fabulous being or demon of the Katahdin region.